capitalist country, but um, one in which there is a pretty significant difference from most other capitalist countries in the world. And um, it's very unusual for new imperialist powers to form. And the logic for that is, I think, pretty clear. Um, imperialist powers exploit and dominate the economies of most of the rest of the world. And so if your economy is being dominated by foreign monopolies, then it's very difficult for your domestic capitalists to create powerful monopolies that can compete on a global sense with them, and for your state to be able to carry out activities in the interests of those monopolies. But in China, while foreign companies had been allowed to create some production in China and to invest in China throughout this, the bulk of the actual economic infrastructure of China remained in the hands of now a new class of Chinese capitalists who were not, in most ways, directly dependent on any major foreign monopoly, and who were not subordinated to the interests of an existing power. And this really allows for Chinese capital to play a more independent role in the world and to develop more thoroughly and more rapidly than capitalism in semi-colonies across the world is able to. So what allowed this China to go from this position to its current role as an imperialist power? One of the big sort of moments that creates this opportunity that China takes advantage of, that Chinese monopoly capital takes advantage of, is the 2008 economic crisis, which has a pretty devastating impact on economies across the world in all the major imperialist powers, but a much lesser impact in China itself. And so this creates a couple of opportunities. Firstly, it allows China to be seen as a sort of a major engine for global growth, in contrast to the sort of sclerotic economies in Europe or the United States at the time. It also allows them access to a lot of the firms and marketplaces that are being opened up through austerity drives. And Portugal presents one of the clearest examples of this. So in Portugal, which had a major debt crisis in conjunction with the economic crisis there was a major sell-off of state assets that was directed by the Troika, by the IMF, the ECB, the European Central Bank, and the European Commission. And you have major sell-off of Portuguese assets. And capitalists in France and Germany and the United Kingdom pretty much assume that they're going to be able to purchase most of these at very low rates. So the United States is sort of heavily hit by the crisis, so they'll get some portion of it, but not much. And the European Union has such direct influence in Portugal, they think, well, we're going to be able to purchase all these assets. And what they didn't account for is that China is able to come in and outbid them on a lot of these. And in fact, China ends up buying about 45% of the assets that were sold off by the Portuguese government, including in certain cases like the major electric producer Energias de Portugal, which was sort of targeted by this bid from a German utility company, E.ON, which received explicit public backing from Angela Merkel. And the Portuguese decided to sell it to China Three Gorges instead, in part sort of as a direct up yours to Merkel, who had sort of come out a little too strongly and made it very unpopular by like basically appearing to demand the sale directly to this German company. You also saw in Greece a similar development. You have China presenting itself as this alternative to the Troika and as an alternative source of capital and investment. The port of Piraeus, outside of Athens, has 2/3 of it purchased by the China Ocean Shipping Company. And they start to carry out a rapid transformation of this port. And I think this really demonstrates how Chinese monopoly capital operates internationally, and how you can start to see the similarities between how Chinese monopoly capital operates and how other monopoly capitals do. So in Piraeus, there's a massive cut down in wages. There's a abolishing of the safety and other trainings, and there's a severe cut down in the number of workers who are employed. And so this starts a major fight with the dock workers union in Piraeus. And so what COSCO, the China Ocean Shipping Company, does is it reaches out to Golden Dawn, the fascist organization in Greece, and allows their members to sort of patrol its section of the port and keep unions out, at the same time carrying out firings of and reprisals against workers who are involved in the union or who protest against conditions there. There's a really incredible set of quotes from the CEO of the Chinese subsidiary there, Fu Changqi, excuse me. And I think this is a really incredible couple of quotes that I'm gonna, so I'll just read a short excerpt. When he's talking about the situation in Piraeus, he says, everybody works with respect for the other. We listen to what our employees say and react to it. The company is like a family. We're all brothers. Everyone is happy. And then he gets asked about, well, what about all these disputes with the union? What about all these workers who are complaining? And then he replies to the interviewer, the union leaders promise their members more money for less work. How is that supposed to work? If you want a higher salary, you first need to work hard, not lie on the beach and drink beer. Learn from the Germans. Work hard, never be lazy, and always work seriously. Hard work, happy life. And just because, you know, nothing in Chinese politics is complete without the absurd juxtaposition, he earlier in this interview has been talking about how he considers himself a socialist and how he can, you know, recite all these phrases from Mao's Little Red Book that he learned when he was in the Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution. And he just goes on and puts out this absolutely, you know, incredible statement that you would find to perfectly fit in with any Western capitalist fighting against a union. And this sort of presentation as China as an alternative to Western powers, that it doesn't have a history of colonialism, that it can offer a better deal to certain countries, that it, you know, doesn't demand certain political changes to a country's government as part of its investment. That's a major factor in China's efforts to expand across the world. It's particularly effective in places like Africa, which have suffered so dramatically from the predations of Western imperialist powers that sort of any alternative seems like it might be worth trying. And so to look into a little of what Chinese investment looks like in Africa, I'm just gonna, I mean, China invests very heavily in a huge amount of Africa. It would take hours and hours to go over everything. I'm just going to look at two particular examples that I think really show a lot of the range of Chinese investment and economic influence across Africa. So first of all, I would turn to Zambia. And this is sort of exemplary of the early investment China does in Africa in the early 2000s. It's extensively based in resource interests to feed Chinese industry, particularly in copper mining, as well as coal, iron ore, and similar products. In 1998, China purchases a section of the privatized, previously state-owned mining companies, Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, and they develop a mine in Chambishi in Zambia. And Chinese mines in Zambia typically pay about 30% less than what had been standard in the country prior to that. The conditions there are extremely unsafe. Workers need to work about 2 years in order to be issued a helmet. Deadly accidents are very common. In 2005, you have a explosion at a factory that's creating mining explosives that's owned by Chinese companies and is located like at the location of one of these mines. It kills 52 people. In 2006, you see the first establishment of a special economic zone in Africa. And it's set up at Chambishi, where this major copper mine is being developed. It's a process that's repeated across a lot of Africa and then large sections elsewhere. You see special economic zones in places like Egypt or Tanzania. And these sort of serve as an entry point for Chinese capital. Under very expanded legal rights, reduced taxation, many ways very similar to the special economic zones that were set up in China itself, although in most cases with a greater ability to actually purchase control of companies in these countries. And you start to see the extent of Chinese influence there in terms of stuff like the Column coal mine, where there was a protest by workers against the bad conditions and the wages there, and a group of Chinese managers opened fire on these workers with shotguns, wounded 11 of them, and the Zambian government intervened, dropped charges against these managers, and allowed them to return to China. And why might they be doing that? Well, in 2008,